Live.
Hello, fellow listeners. Welcome to another edition of Socialist Action webcast. My name is Elizabeth, and I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action and a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in a place called Toronto. Today, I'm speaking to you from Jamaica, where the indigenous Taino and Arawak-speaking people began arriving here 4,000 years ago, but were wiped out by European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is socialism and religion, with gay rights pioneer John Wilson, plus Emily Sayers in Guelph, Alex Badila in Toronto, and Helen Smith in Vancouver. John will speak for about 25 minutes, followed by Emily, Alex, and Ellen, who will speak up to 7 minutes each. Then we will take questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the website directly from YouTube and by typing the question into the chat column. You may direct your questions to an individual panelist or to all. Also, the panel can answer their own question or any other question as they wish. If you agree with what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or by calling us 647-986-1917. Now let's welcome our first speaker. John Wilson is a pioneer of the LGBTQI movement in Ontario. He helped to organize the first gay rights demonstration held on Parliament Hill back in August 1971. He is a leading member of Socialist Action, and he is a steering committee member of Queer Ontario. Welcome, John.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for joining us. You've all heard of the old saying that if you want to get along with people, never discuss politics or religion. Warning, we're about to violate both taboos. I want to begin by examining the Revolutionary Socialist Party has to say about religion in general and in relation to its own members. Our position on this dates all the way back to Lenin and Luxemburg. Let me provide two quotes. From Rosa Luxemburg, quote, "The social democracy in no way fights against religious beliefs. On the contrary, it demands freedom of conscience for every individual and widest possible toleration for every faith and every opinion." Unquote. From Lenin, "But under no circumstances ought we to fall into the error of posing the religious question in an abstract, idealistic fashion as an intellectual question, unconnected to the class struggle, as is not infrequently done by the radical Democrats from among the bourgeoisie. It would be stupid to think that, in a society based on the endless oppression and coarsening of the worker masses, religious prejudices could be dispelled by purely propaganda methods. No number of pamphlets and no amount of preaching can enlighten the proletariat if it is not enlightened by its own struggle against the dark forces of capitalism. Unity in this really revolutionary struggle of the oppressed class for the creation of a paradise on earth is more important to us than the unity of proletarian opinion on paradise and heaven. Regardless of our support for the right of individuals to belong to whatever religion they might choose and to espouse religious ideas, we call for the total separation of church and state. No recognition, no subsidies, no privileges for religious institutions. We all know that this is not the case in this country and in many, many others. The capitalist state props up organized religion because it is in the interest of the ruling class it serves to do so. Religion as such is no bar to a revolutionary party engaging in mass struggles with others who may have strong religious affiliations or ideas. The strategy of the United Front enables us to work on the basis of common agreement on one issue or several, while putting aside differences on other issues. The Vietnam anti-war movement in Canada, the US, and internationally was a striking example of this. This movement became powerful enough to bring an end to an imperialist war. And revolutionary socialists were in the leadership of this movement in several countries, notably the US and Canada. In the US particularly, a strong connection developed between Trotskyists and the Quakers, despite conflicting views in many areas, notably the issue of pacifism. This was possible because of a principled and honest collaboration developed between us, in glaring contrast to the dishonesty and double-dealing experienced with liberal social democrats and Stalinists in that movement. Fred Halstead, a prominent Socialist Workers' Party and anti-war leader, describes this in his book Out Now, which I would recommend to anyone. To quote Alan Woods in Defense of Marxism, quote, "Marxism stands on the basis of philosophical materialism, which rules out any supernatural entity or anything outside or above nature. There cannot be a brain without a central nervous system without a material body. The most recent discoveries of genetics in the Human Genome Project have provided incontrovertible evidence for the Marxist standpoint." Among other things, of course, this showed that we have genes in common with rats and even David Suzuki's fruit fly. So there you go. Why do many millions of people still hold religious beliefs? I think that one of the major reasons is the need for the illusion of life after death. Most people's, and I'm quoting here from Alan Woods again, most people's lives in class society are so hard, intolerable, or just meaningless that the idea of life after death seems to be the only way to invest it with any meaning. Marx famously said the following: "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." Critics of Marxism usually quote only the last sentence, trying to obscure the fact that Marx developed an analysis of religion. Religion is a complex subject, full of contradictions. One of the most notable is the chasm between the original ideas and concepts of mainstream religions and what they espouse now. Christianity began as a radical movement in protest against the ruling class of the horrific Roman Empire, its members slaves, former slaves, and the jobless proletariat of Rome. As Luxemburg details, the original Christian movement was communist in the sense of a communism of consumption, not production. All goods were held in common except dwellings, and food and other necessities were shared. But as the church grew in numbers and influence, this began to change. From an opponent, the church changed into an ally of the ruling class, particularly after the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the state religion. Hierarchy and privilege seeking became the priority for the self-appointed leadership. Originally, the church did not even have full-time paid priests. If you see a resemblance to the social democratic and union bureaucracies of our era, you're right. Eventually, the church became the opposite of what it started out as. Sharing in common was supplanted by the dogma that the division of society into classes was divinely ordained. People who defended the original principles were denounced as heretics. History was simply rewritten and falsified. All the major current religions are patriarchal and anti-sex. The insistence of clerical authorities in attempting to regiment the private lives of their subjects reflects their role in promoting class rule and social stability. These religions are heavily invested in the oppression of women, homosexuals, other sexual minorities, racial minorities, religious minorities, and colonized indigenous people. Missionary work promotes submission to colonial occupation authorities and indoctrinating indigenous people in the morality, quote unquote, of class rule. In the so-called West, Christianity is the religion of imperialism. Of course, organized religions are not monolithic, much as they may try to be. The Catholic Church in Latin America is a good example. A large proportion of the rank and file clergy there are horrified by the oppression of the masses and support their struggles, despite the notorious history of the Church's open support of the ruling class, including murderous military dictatorships. Not for nothing did liberation theory originate there. Most mainstream religions like to pretend that they speak for all of their followers, but it is obvious that they don't. I remember when the Pope visited Toronto many, many years ago, the Globe and Mail did a survey which showed that the majority of Canadian Catholics did not agree with the Church's position on birth control and abortion. More recent surveys have shown that a majority of American Catholics not only reject their Church's position on birth control and abortion, but on queer rights as well. And it's impossible not to be aware of the courageous resistance of women and their allies to the subordinate and humiliating role assigned them by the misogynist Church hierarchy. The growth of oppositional currents in establishment religions is encouraging. This reflects changes in the wider society. But I think this does nothing significant to change the essential reactionary rule of organized religion. And I think that the chances of serious change in, say, the Catholic Church are slim to none. What's involved is not just different ideas, but the material and social interests of those in control of these institutions. There is enormous wealth and power involved. Just a note about indigenous belief systems and mythologies. Generally, these do not have the negative aspects of religion and class societies because they developed in a society without class divisions. They were an attempt by these peoples to understand the world they were in and their place in it. One of the most startling differences from capitalist society was the acceptance of different sexualities. I can recall reading an article in the Toronto Star, which talked about an indigenous tribe which recognized up to 14 different genders. Well, I think I've gone on long enough, so on to the discussion.
Okay, John. That's you have a lot more time, but that's good. That's good. Okay, so our next speaker, Emily Steers, who is a leading member of Socialist Action Canada, based in Guelph, Ontario. She helped to organize a union for teaching assistants at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, and now sings in the community and works as a music teacher. Welcome, Emily.
From Galatians. For in Christ Jesus you are all children of God, and for as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. Thus there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave or bonded, nor free. There is no male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. Mark chapter 12. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second commandment is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. From Matthew chapter 19. And behold, one came up to him and said, Good master, what things shall I do that I may have eternal life? And Jesus said to him, Why dost thou call me good? There is none good but one, that is, God. But if you will enter this life, keep the commandments. And he said, Which ones? Jesus replied, Thou shalt do no murder, shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, and shalt not bear false witness. Honor thy father and mother, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The young man said unto him, All these things I have kept. What do I lack? Thus Jesus said, If you will be perfect, go and sell all that you have, and give it to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. And then come and follow me. But when the young man heard this saying, He went away sorrowful, for he had a great many possessions and did not wish to divest himself of them. Thus Jesus said to his disciples, I say unto you that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It is in these teachings that I find myself. I am the queer daughter of 2 priests, taught from an early age that wealth is immaterial to salvation and to living a good life, and that I should try to build my life and my ethos around a deep and abiding love for all people. Truly, no one should have been surprised when I became a socialist. I would also like to credit an article from Marxism Today, written in 1980 by Tony Benn. I'll post it in the comments when I'm done. I also want to acknowledge that while I'm talking from my own perspectives about Christianity, there is lots of other fruitful discussions to be had around this topic with members of all religious traditions around the world. There is different context and different histories in every corner of the world, and this is only mine. Additionally, in this webcast, as John mentioned, we are not discussing much about Indigenous spirituality and religion, which has governed relationships to people and land in this place since time immemorial. I am a firm believer that Christianity, and indeed all faith, has a significant role to play in the revolution. Indeed, at the time of Jesus of Nazareth, and still today, his teachings remain a radical call towards compassionate humanity that has been veiled time and time again in mystery, obfuscation, and deliberate restriction by the powers that wish to keep the working classes oppressed. Jesus of Nazareth, not the deified Christ, but the man, he preached a message of unprecedented divestment from wealth and power, instead turning to the power of people. His message was one of uplifting the downtrodden and oppressed and liberating people from imperialism and inequality. Radical Christian thought has left its fingerprints all across revolutionary movements and ideology around the world. Indeed, a lot of secular humanism borrows heavily from Christian egalitarianism while stripped of its theological underpinnings. We see it in the movement of the Diggers and the Levelers of 17th century England, in the radical equality and then subsequent persecutions of the Quakers and the Mennonites, the writings of the Chartists, and even today in the eco-socialist concepts of stewardship towards land rather than dominion over it. We see it in the works of Paulo Freire and Martin Luther King Jr. We, as radical Christians, seek to build the kingdom of God here, as paradise on earth. Indeed, there are a great many radical churches who are engaged in a great deal of mutual aid work, from providing meals and safe consumption sites to refugee sponsorship and shelter work. The problem often arises when any religion, but especially historically the church, when the church invests itself in statehood rather than as a fixture of pluralism and diversity in a multicultural ecumenical mosaic. Again, as John said, damn you, Constantine. Statehood begets hierarchical power structures and encourages the accrual of wealth, which is deeply, deeply antithetical to original Christian theology. Christianity has thus been weaponized and appropriated by the state in multiple ways over generations, as a tool of colonialism, a tool of conquest, a tool of war, a tool of imperialism, a tool of genocide, a tool of violent and ongoing racism, sexism, homophobia, misogyny. But we also see a millennia-long tug of war between state powers trying to bury the message of Jesus of Nazareth and the message of neighborly, unconditional, and undying love, which seeps out through the cracks and takes root time and time again. I am a big believer that with caution and consideration, radical Christians can work collaboratively alongside multiple faiths and secular movements in a united front approach to liberty and equality. We have talked a lot in this space, including in a webcast a few months ago, about the importance of united front work in joining hands and building an ethos of liberation, of collaboration with people from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different ideological perspectives, and how fruitful those things can be. There's one last thing, and I was trying to segue this in neatly, but I couldn't. So I'm just going to mention it as a complete non sequitur. But I want to highlight the importance of church space and faith worship space as one of the last bastions of community centered place that does not rely on the spending of money and that doesn't rely on nuclear family ties and structures to form community care. Where else in life, aside from, in the we see this in the union, the unions of old, less so nowadays, but mostly today in faith places. Where else do we find multi-generational space where there are elderly people, single people, families, teenagers, all collaboratively coming together with a common ethos and common community, building something together and supporting one another for no other reason than they share space and they share a care and love for each other. That is an incredibly rare thing. And as we've seen time and time again, capitalism thrives off of isolation and divestment from community structures. These community structures that are held and provided by religious spaces provide a blueprint and a template for networks of community care that we should strive to build in secular spaces and fight back against the isolationism of capitalism.
Elizabeth, you're muted.
Okay. All right. You see, the host even does it. Sorry about that, folks.
Sorry, Elizabeth, you're camera.
Boy, oh boy, I'm not having a good night, am I, Mr. Producer? Am I fired? Okay. Our next speaker is Alex Badila. He's a young worker who likes to write poetry and works as a computer programmer for Ernst & Young. He graduated from the University of Toronto in 2017 with a degree in computer engineering. He is a member of Socialist Action in Toronto. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, comrades. My name is Alex, and I would like to start off, similar to Comrade and Emily, with a parable from this book, which is one of the many Buddhist Bibles. So this is the Buddha speaking. Disciples, in a past life there were many birds and beasts playing as they gathered in a bamboo grove at the base of the Himalayan mountains. Among the birds there was a parrot. At one time a storm suddenly arose, and bamboos rubbed each other, thereby causing a fire that set the bamboo grove ablaze. The birds and beasts were frightened and tried to flee. They were running here and there among the rising flames. The parrot, being moved by deep compassion, felt the pain of his fellow animals. He soaked his wings in water and flew up into the sky, sprinkling water over the raging flames. With unlimited concern, he repeated this without cease. This shook the heavenly abode of Indra, and the deity came forth and said to the parrot, "This great fire in the bamboo grove extends over many miles. How do you expect to extinguish it by dripping water from your wings?" The parrot answered, "I have a great heart, and if I work hard and am not slack in my efforts, then I am sure to be able to extinguish this great fire. If I cannot accomplish it in this life, I will be able to finish it in the next." Indra was moved by the parrot's aspiration and let fall a great rain that extinguished the fire. Disciples, that parrot was I. As I am trying to extinguish the flames of the three poisons of all people now, so did I, in my previous life, have the same concern for all beings. So I really like this parable. It's actually my favorite parable in all of Buddhism because it reminds me that my contribution matters, no matter how small, and that sometimes it feels impossible to enact change, but it's important not to give up. This has helped me with my activism because it's stopped me from fully burning out. Now I'd like to talk about my journey with Buddhism because it was actually Buddhism that led me to socialism. I first learned of Buddhism through mindfulness to treat mental health problems, and it did help a lot with my depression and anxiety. And back in 2019, I was feeling lost and like life had no meaning. So I decided to look back on mindfulness and then go to the source, which was Buddhism. It really helped me find meaning in my life. And it taught that things I considered of high importance, which were a job, having a job and a girlfriend, which I didn't have either one at that time. It taught me that those weren't that important, really. What was important was being happy with myself. And once I was able to take care of myself, this is really important, I was able to work on helping others. I first learned gratitude for things I had, which made me more aware of my privileges. Then I learned compassion for living beings and the urge to ease their suffering. Then I learned about wisdom, seeing things as they truly are. It was actually my Buddhist meditation instructor that got me into activism through his passion of combating climate change. I had known about climate change before, but I didn't know what to do about it. It all felt so hopeless. I thought that, the apocalypse was coming, might as well just give up and wait to die. But activism gave me things I could do to help make the world a better place. Through my compassion, I saw much suffering in the world. The newfound wisdom and experience with activism, it became much clearer to me how systems like capitalism were fundamentally broken. It gave me the desire to change those systems. I soon realized that protesting and lobbying the government only went so far. I wanted to do more. So I became an anarchist and went to a local reading group. This was back in 2020 during the pandemic, so of course the reading group was online. Through the group, I learned about the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations, which deals with tenants' rights, also known as FMTA, and I joined it. Through FMTA, I learned of the Encampment Support Network, or ESN, event in Moss Park, campaigning for the rights of homeless people in that park. This was in September 2020. I went to the ESN event, saw Socialist Action there, interacted with them, joined the mailing list, and the rest is history. Now, the main concepts and teaching of Buddhism, mainly gratitude, compassion, and wisdom, are completely compatible with socialism. And these concepts are not unique to Buddhism either, but can be found in some form in most religions. Therefore, religion and socialism need not be enemies. I once had a conversation with a comrade about religion and socialism. He said that in a socialist society, there would still be religion. It would just look very different from what it is today. For example, there'll be separation of church and state, and there'll be no using religion to argue against science or just, facts in general. These are things I agree with, and I'm sure that many other religious people do as well. Lastly, religion helped nourish and reinvigorate me when things look bleak. It's true that you need to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. It's like that whole adage with the oxygen mask where you have to put it on yourself before you put it on someone else. Buddhism gave me hope for the future, which was important for me to keep going, especially in activist circles where people burn out all the time. That little parable at the beginning has helped me persevere through hardship. Those few paragraphs about a parrot, as silly as it sounds, have made sure I don't give up hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much. And now, Helen Smith is a retired professor of English and a longtime participant in the British Columbia Humanist Association. She is a public housing advocate and a member of Socialist Action in Vancouver, British Columbia. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to make the case for socialism and atheism. And I want to point out that we live in a period of time when secularism is on the ascendancy around the world. It's a very positive time for people who want to separate church and state. There have been numerous polls done, and they're getting to be quite representative. The Canadian Census, the National Household Survey, the Wynne Gallup poll, international poll, the Pew Research Center, Angus Reid polls, the Bibby Project Canada Survey Series, and Statistics Canada. And it's believed that there's about a 9% increase in non-belief around the world each decade now. And in some countries like Canada, it means that non-belief will become the single largest belief system in the next decade or so. At the moment in Canada, Canada has about a quarter of the population saying that they're non-religious or that explicitly atheist or agnostic on official surveys that are done. And that amounts to about 8 million people in Canada. This is no small number. It's a good number indeed. And that non-belief, no religion, is the number 2 belief system in Canada when you're looking at religious belief systems. The atheists have found that when they do this a little more closely and ask people more questions, the numbers of non-believers grows. For instance, if a person may say, do you believe in religion and do you believe in a God? They may say yes to that. But when you ask them, well, what denomination are you? And how often do you attend your religious institution? Suddenly the numbers start to drop away. And right now in Canada, only about 10% of the population actually attend a religious institution on a weekly basis. It has been dropping quite phenomenally. At the worldwide rate is about 9% a decade, and it's doing so in Canada. This movement of secularism and non-belief is strongest in British Columbia and Quebec. In BC, most recent figures out show that about 44% of the population, that's just under 2 million people, now register themselves as non-religious. In the city urban center of Vancouver, that figure rises to just over 50%. And when the polls that are conducted are done by humanist organizations, they find that that number is even higher because they put the no religion answer higher up on the list of options. So it tends to makes people more confident that they can put down that they're non-religious if they are indeed non-religious. In Quebec, about 33% of the population now say they're non-religious. And since many of you will be in Ontario, about a quarter, about 3 million people say that they're non-religious. Now, this is a worldwide phenomenon. About 36% of people in the world now also say that they're non-religious. And in countries like France, amongst the religious population, 58% say that they don't attend Mass at all. And only 7% of their population attend Mass on a weekly basis. In the UK, the figures are high as well. 42% are atheist or agnostic. So something's happening, and people have speculated the reason for this. Some people say, well, it's to do with the rise of science and the internet. People are able now, if they've got a problem, they can look up a solution on the internet, and they don't have to pray for guidance. They can actually find some facts, so that might well be a reason. But I'm going to suggest that it's the rise of the social movements. As John Wilson mentioned, the rise of the gay liberation movement, women's rights and Black rights in the 60s that may have contributed to this. And I want to put in a little socialist part of this as well, that secularism and socialism has been around since the end of the 17th century. We can think about the French Revolution in the 18th century. That had explicitly atheist and secular documents attached to it. In the 19th century, in the United States, the Thomas Paine societies that set up, they were all atheist societies as well. Then the anti-slavery movement in the United States had individuals who started off religious, who became abolitionists, who came under attack from their churches for being abolitionists and moved away from religion and became part of the secular movement in the United States. I'm thinking of Moncure Conway. He was a Unitarian who got very badly treated in his church and ended up with a secular movement in France and in the United Kingdom. He had to flee the country. The Chartist uprisings in the UK had a strong secular thrust. Uprisings in France in the 19th century. Here in Canada, the Upper Canada Rebellion with William Lyon Mackenzie, they issued documents that were explicitly about separation of church and state. The rise of the ethical culture societies in North America and Europe. The 1917 Russian Revolution, explicitly atheist and secular sentiments in their propaganda. And in the 1960s, the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, again, a secular movement, separate church and state, leading on to the gay liberation, the women's rights and black rights movement in the 1960s. So secularism today is on the rise and has a long history in the socialist movement, but is much broader than that, and something that we need to address and that we need to bring into a socialist direction. The scandals of the churches in North America in particular, but around the world also, I think is probably one of the reasons why there is a rise in secularism. The raising of consciousness of people around sexism, racism, and homophobia have brought them to see that there's systemic discrimination that's come out of the institutions that the churches have looked after. Whether it's the residential schools that the indigenous people suffered horrendous abuse, whether it's the women who have had churches try to constrain their reproductive rights, including their rights to abortion and their rights to have leadership roles as workers and people in society. The mother and child homes and the orphanages that were run by churches that have been rocked by scandals, LGBTQ rights, who've had to put up with abuse from people in the churches who cite biblical passages against them, including Genesis 9, Sodom and Gomorrah, Leviticus 18 and 20, Corinthians 6, Timothy 1, and Romans 1. I can list the 7 more that they use against women and women's rights, which I will cite. They cite Ephesians 5, Timothy 2, Corinthians 2, Colossians 3, Peter 3, and Titus 2, all of those saying that women are to play submissive roles in society and within the family and the home and also within their churches and are not to rise to leadership. So there's a great broad swelling of support for these social movements today, and that's why we're witnessing a backlash by the churches. It's because they're in a weaker position. It's because secularism is growing that they're in this situation. Here in Canada, the Humanist Canada, which is an atheist organization, a secular humanist organization, was founded in 1968 by the very famous Henry Morgentaler, Dr. Henry Morgentaler in Montreal. He was known, of course, he was the abortion doctor and a socialist, lifelong socialist. And since then, there have been humanist groups spring up across the country in all the provinces, and some groups spring up in cities. The city of Toronto has its own humanist group. And they've been involved in a series of campaigns which match the social movements that are around it. So right now, they're still involved in a struggle for women's rights, gay rights, particularly trans rights right now, abortion rights, medical assistance in dying, separation of church and state in the school system and hospital system, and etc. So these are just some of the things that they've been involved with. And if you're a socialist and an atheist in Canada, please do get in touch with one of these organizations. They're quite radical in nature. They change over time, right? And it depends on the people who go to them. But I think you'll find like-minded people there. In conclusion, then, I'd like to say that we live in a growing secular society which is responding to working class activism where the church plays less and less of a role. Most of the churches record a decline in membership. The fact remains that in the modern secular world, most people are not listening to backward ideas about the family, and they are practicing their own sexuality in their own ways, practicing safe sex, using birth control, and accessing abortion when required. Women are taking leadership positions in society without regard to the religious strictures that would be placed on them by the churches. And LGBTQ people in particular are practicing their sexuality, breaking the taboos of religious restraint. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you all. And now, with the help of our technical producer, Kurt Young, let's hear some questions from our online audience. We will take 3 questions in the first round, and then call on our panelists to respond to one or more of the questions as they wish. So, Kurt, it's over to you for the 3 questions.
Okay, so our first question comes from Barry Wiseletter. He asks, what do most religions seek to restrict, or why do most religions seek to restrict women's reproductive rights and oppose a woman's right to choose abortion? Dr. T asks, I think those views are correct with regard to monotheistic religions. Monotheistic religions have also been the destroyers of pantheistic and mystical practices views on the latter two, in that the latter two are both religions and view people as a component of the natural world and are egalitarian as opposed to the mainstream religions. Rob McBean asks, to what extent do you think that religion teaches mythology as fact today? For example, God made the world in 7 days. Women are made from the ribs of men. How should socialists respond?
Okay, so you've seen the 3 questions, and our lineup to report back will be Emily, Alex, Helen, and John. And you have up to 6 minutes each to answer one or all of the questions. Emily?
Yes, so I have a lot to say, so I'll try to keep it brief. And one of the things, and I think Alex has has reminded us that when talking about socialism and religion and religious place in life, it is very, very important to distinguish between, North American and European Christianity, as opposed to just using the blanket term religion, which, as we know, applies to many, many, many different things and has many variations. And it becomes very difficult to have a nuanced conversation when we have this blanket statement. But to the question, why do a lot of religions, and this is true, why do a lot of religions seek to restrict women's reproductive rights? I'm going to take this tack as property rights. So basically, if we view, so right of inheritance dictates that, children inherit their father's property. Women cannot own property. And therefore, reproductive control thus becomes a tool of wealth accrual, making sure that your children are the ones who inherit your property, and your children are seen as your property. And that provides a lot of impetus for reproductive control. It always comes back to property and material possessions, doesn't it? And again, so the opposition to a woman's right to choose abortion, again, complex. Again, part of it is just the need to control women's bodies because women are not seen as fully human. That has been a mainstay in a lot of different cultures and societies, and not just in Christian-influenced ones. To Dr. T's question about monotheistic religions, I mean, pantheistic practices can still be deeply oppressive and have severe consequences. I mean, Hinduism in India, for example, with the caste system and the rise of Hindu nationalism that we are seeing today, is very, very frightening for a lot of reasons, and has historically justified a lot of wrongs, but also has a lot of pluralistic thought. There's no Hindu orthodoxy. There's a lot of deep complexity within Hinduism. So it's very difficult to say. Again, I'm going to come back to the problem is when any religion, pantheistic or monotheistic, invests itself in statehood. That's when we run into problems. That's when you run into issues of control, of accrual of wealth, of justification of systems of oppression and of class. And I think there's a lot to learn from a lot of pantheistic and other pagan and other spiritual traditions about relationships to people, relationships to land, and relationships to the natural world. I cannot speak to much of that because that is not my area of expertise, so I don't want to misspeak on that issue. To what extent does religion teach mythology as fact? I mean, Christian fundamentalism and conservative Christian is one of my greatest enemies of all time, and it is something that is deeply frustrating and is a deep cause of social evil today. I'm not going to deny that. I mean, most Christians I know, and I've realized that I come from a very particular school of Christian thought, but I have never heard those things taught as fact. They have always been taught to me and to everyone I know as allegories, as ways of understanding the world, as constructions of belief, rather than as, this is a fact, this is truth. And I think, to Ellen's question, part of the reason that we have this Christian backlash is because of the rise of secularism and this fear of losing power. Again, I am a firm believer that if the church is to survive in any kind of recognizable form, it needs to immediately divest itself from statehood. And there are a lot of organizations and denominations that are doing that. As I said, the Mennonites and the Quakers provide really, really phenomenal examples of what spirituality and Christian faith can be in a good way and in a modern way. So I will leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. Emily, sorry. Alex?
Yes, okay. Let's go with Rob's question. So I'm gonna do I'm gonna go off what Comrade Emily said. So I can't speak for other religions, but I can speak for my own. Very much in the Buddhism that I practice, which is Shin Buddhism. It's a Japanese flavor of Buddhism. Very much of it is mythological, and it talks about metaphor and talking about not factual truth, but sort of like an emotional truth. So it doesn't, my religion does not teach mythology as fact. In fact, when I started going to temple, I used to think that the main figure we worship, Amida Buddha, was like an actual sort of being. And then I learned recently that no, he's just a symbol. He's a symbol for infinite compassion and wisdom. So that was interesting. I thought, I have to believe all these like supernatural things, but in the end, it's very much mythological and metaphorical. And I'll just do Dr. T's question. Okay, so interesting fact about Buddhism. Buddhism is what we call an atheistic religion because there are no gods. There is Buddha. Buddha was a human being. There are supernatural powers and all that. So it does believe in the supernatural, but it does not believe that there are creator gods or stuff like that. So I don't know if I'd consider it a pantheistic religion as well, because it does teach of interconnectedness, which is something I sort of touched on with compassion, but interconnectedness is like everything is one, we are all one, and it does talk about like, being one with nature and all that stuff. And that's what that's why climate change activism works so well with that. They're and like my religion is pretty egalitarian. They actually did what I know of, they did a lot of like same-sex marriages before it was legal. Fun fact, what's his name? George Takei, the Sulu from Star Trek. He was a Shin Buddhist, and he got married at the temple, and I thought that was cool. All right, that is it for me.
Elizabeth, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I just didn't mute myself. I don't know what happened. Helen?
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to answer the questions in order first. To Barry's question, why do most religions seek to restrict women's reproductive rights and oppose a woman's right to choose abortion? I think Emily really answered this very well. It's to do with the right-wing ideology that they have about the bourgeois family, about a woman as chattel, as like equivalent of a piece of furniture that's owned by the man, and that he has to control her sexuality in order to maintain his position. This is breaking down. It's a reality that in Canada today, we have a great diversity of social structures. Women have moved ahead tremendously in women's rights, even though we still have to fight a backlash that keeps occurring over and over, but we're doing well. And 60% of our population here in British Columbia no longer live in units. So a lot of people are living alone now, or living in non-family units with roommates or whatever, but not family. And this is probably due to the high housing crisis, a lot of it. And so there's a lot of things breaking up this ideology of the bourgeois family. And the churches may hold on to it, especially the evangelical and the mainstream Roman Catholic Church, trying to hold on to it, but it's going to break. It's going to have to break. And I think that really leads next actually to Rob McBean's question, because when religions find that the world around them is changing, they have to decide what they're going to do. So he asks, Rob McBean, to what extent do you think that religion teaches mythology as fact today? I think that depends very much on the religion. I think there are some churches that teach things like the virgin birth, resurrection, God made the world in 7 days. They differ on to what extent they believe in. But certainly the Roman Catholic Church and the evangelicals present that as a truth, to what they think is a truth. And what happens is that there are schisms and breaks within the churches as people know that these are myths, these are just stories, these are things that couldn't possibly happen. And it split the churches, and there's splits the clergy, and it splits the congregations, and a group of people will leave and break away from the churches when they're faced with this kind of a schism, and they are part of the growing ranks of the non-religious. This is the same when they're confronted with the social movements. They know that, for instance, homosexuality is not a sin. People know that. But when they're faced with a church that tells them it's an abomination and quotes Leviticus at them, they are put on the spot of having to make a decision of whether they're going to believe that religion or not. And more people are turning away from the churches and heading towards a secular society because they won't put up with that kind of nonsense. Okay, I have 2 minutes. On pantheistic religion, I'm just looking up some statistics for you, Dr. T. I'm trying to see, that's a good point about pantheism, because our census is very dominated by sort of Western mainstream religions. And I'm not sure, there's a category that people can check called spiritual but not religious. That is growing in number. On the 2011 National Household Survey, Indigenous spirituality was claimed by 65,000 people in Canada. So there, you'd have to take a look at the statistics and try to find out whether the surveys are actually asking enough questions to get a feedback on that. But obviously their practices are quite different from the mainstream churches. And many of them are more egalitarian, as you say, as opposed to those mainstream religions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. John? You're muted, John. Just hit your microphone.
Okay.
All righty. There we go.
Okay. I'm more used to Zoom, so some of the
It's
buttons.
okay. Don't worry. I've made mistakes all night.
Okay. On the last question that Rob McVean asked, I agree with a lot of what Ellen had to say. I mean, it depends on what the religion is, what the church is. Mostly it's fundamentalists and evangelicals that will teach some of these things as fact, which are having more and more trouble doing, but anyway. But it's really quite ludicrous in the States that the growth of so-called creationism, which of course is totally unscientific. And most religions don't even agree with that. So anyway, I think that the question was answered well on why the church opposes, and the religion generally oppose, the right of women to control their own reproductive life. That's pretty much been answered, I think. And let's see here. Okay, that's about it for me. I think all of the questions actually have been answered fairly satisfactorily. So.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, we're going to go back to our producer, Kurt, for the second round of 3 questions. Kurt?
One moment as I get the questions prepared. Okay, so our first question comes from Andrew, who says, how can Christianity advocate against inequality with verses like Ephesians 6:5? Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Elizabeth Weiss asks, radical Christians appeal to and rely upon moralism. Marxism relies on science. Is that not a more secure and evidence-based system of thought on which to build a better world? And Kurt myself asks, the issue with Christian conservatives is that they do not view people outside of their congregation as their neighbor. What tactics can be used to convert them to a universal perspective?
Okay, thank you, Kurt. We'll go back to our panel, and the order will be Helen, John, Emily, and Alex. And you have up to 6 minutes to answer one or all questions. Helen?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's start with Andrew. How can Christianity advocate against inequality when there are verses like this verse from Ephesians telling slaves to obey their masters? Obviously, there's contradictions for any Christian who is a socialist or has democratic tendencies. They have to realize that what's happening is people cherry pick the Bible. They don't accept the whole Bible as one thing because it's full of contradictions and errors and problems. So they cherry pick the Bible and they pull out the passages that support their position. So you can bring out many passages from the Bible that support the idea of the equality of people. But then you can also pull out one like this one from Ephesians, which does the opposite, right? So there's this happens, and you have to point out to people, well, if you're going to say that the Bible is the divine word of God, you have to explain these other passages in the Bible that are horrendous, full of violence, cruelty towards women, slaves, and others. You have to explain that. So the point is to point out that contradiction and to point to them that they're cherry picking their sources, right? So they're not believing the whole thing. They're not taking in the whole thing. They're just taking sections of it, and they're making what are essentially political arguments out of it. Okay, now as socialists, we know the Bible is not the divine word of God. This was written by people. It was written by people quite a long time after the death of the so-called Christ, if he was a historical figure, and etc. Now, to move on to Elizabeth's question, radical Christians appeal to and rely upon moralism. Marxism relies on science. This is quite right, I think, Elizabeth. The reliance of radical Christians on moralism may be something that's come to them because the churches have emphasized moral arbitration around, for instance, around sexuality. They think it's their business to tell people what they can and cannot do in their bedrooms, right? This is how it's so badly affected women and gay people throughout history. And I'm sorry, I just lost a train of thought there. The antidote to that is to look on science, to see, to understand, that homosexuality is natural. It is part of nature. Women who want to have rights over their lives, that this is natural, and this can be proven through science as well. And so this is our antidote to that. And Kurt, the issue of Christian conservatives is that they do not view people outside their congregation as their neighbor. What tactics can be used to convert them to a universal perspective? That's quite true, and I guess that really has to be done for those people to realize that they live in a multicultural society where people have many different religions, and that they have to be able to get along with those people, to treat them equally, and to live in a fair, just society with them, and that there is no future for people who are going to allow themselves to be divided by religions or by race or by nation, that only leads to war, and we don't want that. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Our next speaker is John.
Okay, well, I'll start with your question, actually. I agree entirely with what you say there, Elizabeth. I think in terms of Kurt's question, I don't really hold a lot of hope out for Christian conservatives or conservatives of any kind. But yeah, they don't. And in fact, they don't regard anybody, in some cases, beyond their block as their neighbor. But anyway, there you go. There is, of course, a contradiction. If people are claiming not all Christians by any means take the Bible literally, and some take the position that the New Testament supersedes the old books of religion. No, these are books basically of mythology, and they were written by different people, and including people that engaged in retroactive prophecy, which is quite an interesting business, and it does work to some extent. But I think that this is I don't really. I think when events change consciousness, as is with the Black Lives Movement phenomenon in the States, particularly, and internationally. It changes consciousness around particular issues, in this case, systemic racism. When conservatives come up against something like that, they change their opinion and they're convinced that something is wrong with the way they think, or else they just keep on doing what they're doing. And Andrew's question, I think it's there's a lot of contradictions there. As I say, I mean, a lot of Christians don't take the Bible literally, and some of them don't take a lot of the main features of, in terms of Christianity, a lot of the main features of Christian religion all that seriously either. And there's a real variety of all kinds of different tendencies and beliefs. So, but it's just, yes, it is a contradiction. And if people don't agree with those things, they should denounce them. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, John. Emily?
Yes, so I'll take these questions in order. So to Andrew's questions, how can Christians advocate against inequality with verses like etc., as we've said. As people have said already, the Bible is not one text. The Bible is a collection of stories and oral histories and letters and communications from lots and lots of different people over the course of several millennia. So with everything that is written, it is important to take into account the historical and political context in which they were written, just as with any piece of literature. And the letter to the Ephesians was written by Paul. Paul had some interesting hangups. Paul, formerly Saul, was not a Jew, but he was a persecutor of Christians, and had a whole moment, and then became one of the founding church fathers and wrote a lot of things that contradict, if not misinterpret, a lot of the writings of Jesus, not the writings of, but the stories of Jesus, in very interesting ways. And it is from him that we get a lot of the foundational issues with church. So, I mean, when in doubt, I refer to gospels rather than letters. There's a lot of really interesting things to unpack in different scriptures. And I think it's always really useful to unpack it, as I say, what is the historical context? Who was this letter to? Why was it being written? What was their particular political and historical situation? And that's, I guess, how I overcome a lot of the contradictions in the Bible, because, as I say, it's a book that was written by thousands of people over the course of millennia. So, of course, there are a lot of weird and wacky and wonderful things in there that need to be taken into account and dealt with through a historical material lens. Elizabeth's question: radical Christians appeal to and rely on moralism, and Marxism relies on science. I guess I just disagree with the idea that humans are inherently rational people, because we know that this is not the case. Humans are emotional beings, humans are relational beings, and humans believe all kinds of things that are not rational and that are not necessarily truthful or factual. And, we can laud, appeals to science all we want, but science is written by humans. The scientific doctrine is written by humans. If you want no other better example than Francis Bacon, saying that we will take nature by the hair and tame her to our will. That is a violently misogynistic, anti-nature viewpoint, but he's one of the founders of modern scientific thinking. So there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of bias. There's a lot of emotional and non-rational perspectives in any line of thinking. And I think that's really important to consider. that we don't fall prey to the Enlightenment trap of rationality, because humans are never, ever solely rational creatures. Finally, Kurt's question. This is one of the questions that keeps me up at night, and I don't have a good answer. But I mean, as with anything, what are the tactics that we use to engage working class people around the world? Class solidarity, material support in times of hardship, and consistently demonstrating a better way. And fighting like hell against white supremacy, against neo-Nazism, against all of those things that we know to be deeply, deeply evil, and deeply, deeply corrupting and harmful. I don't know if there is a way to convert them to a universal perspective, but at least we can convert bystanders. Yeah, as I say, how do we radicalize anyone? How do we turn anyone to our perspective? Living the truth and demonstrating to ways that it's effective and helping people in need.
Thank you, Emily. Alex.
Yes. So all these questions are about Christianity, but I'm going to pretend that they also ask about Buddhism, because why not? Kurt's question, I'm honestly going to skip because I have no idea. So to Andrew's question, Buddhism does have a lot of problems as well, especially with sexism. That was a big thing in Buddhism. And Buddhism as well, the Buddha taught for 35 years. There's a lot of contradictions in what he says, and that's because he uses something called skillful means, which he taught to a lot of different audiences, and he had to adjust his teachings in such a way that the audiences got the point. So if it seems like it's very contradictory, that he contradicts himself, that he says something incredibly sexist, a lot of it I found was like skillful means to try to get people to a certain point. Now, I'm not defending the sexist stuff, and I do agree with Emily that there is like a lot of context, and like they have to look at the historical context and which everything was written. But yeah, that explains the contradictions in Buddhism. In Elizabeth's question, so I don't think it's a choice of either science or religion. I think both can actually intermingle. This is the case for Buddhism because there's I think with Buddhism, it's pretty good when it comes to science and religion, because a lot of well, let's say like, okay, the Dalai Lama, he actually said that if science contradicted religion, then religion had to change. So that's pretty cool. I think that's that's one of the spiritual leaders, and saying that religion is not infallible. And there's there's a lot of things that Buddhism used to teach, and there's like after there came like scientific basis afterwards. Like, for example, meditation has a lot of research, not all of it great, but there's a lot of research in how it sort of like betters the mind and everything. So I'm rambling. I'm going to stop now.
Thanks, Alex, but you weren't rambling. Okay, so back to Kurt for our last round of questions. So if you could put the 3 in the chat, please.
Okay, so our first question comes from Mitchell Short. Yes. There are about 70 million evangelical Christians in the United States today. They honestly believe the Bible is the Word of God. They believe in miracles and angels. Many are working class people. As Marxists, how do we deal with the rampant growth of the Christian right? How do we break through their mystical illusions when their only reaction for socialist transformation is hate and violence? Barry Weiseter asks, how do you account for the impressive rise in secularism despite the rise in economic and environmental crisis and stress in human life? Could it be that scientific socialism is a more reliable, better ally of movements for working class emancipation and liberation from all forms of oppression? And the final question is from myself, who asks, without the church, what institutions can we use to establish a sense of community among the working class?
Okay, so we're back to the panelists, and the lineup this time will be Alex, Helen, Emily, and John. And this time we only have 4 minutes each. So I hope you can answer one or all three in 4 minutes. Alex, you're on.
I don't know how to answer these questions, so I will pass. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Helen?
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll answer Mitchell's question first. Thank you for that number. 70 million evangelical Christians. That's frightening, isn't it? Anyway, the good news is they're declining in number slightly now. They're not growing. They were growing about 10 years ago. Apparently, they were growing in number, but they're now they're starting to lose. I believe it's at a rate of like 5% a year or something. So we saw a lot of those mega churches set up and those community churches, those little tiny community churches. These were all evangelical churches. We saw them rise up to about 10 years ago, but now apparently they're slightly on they're decreasing in size. So how do we break through their mystical illusions? Well, I don't think it's a worry. I mean, it has to be obvious. I mean, how can people fall for a virgin birth? I mean, you don't have to be too bright to figure out there's no such thing as a virgin birth. The resurrection, you've never seen anybody come back from the dead. Science has pretty well cut through the rest of the myths. I don't think it's too difficult. I think that they'll come to it themselves, and that we need to focus on the social transformation of society. It was let me think now. It was Karl Marx in his early works in the 1840s. He said that it's the religions reflect mode of production. And I think that we are moving on because of the internet and because of the growth of science. I think we're moving on enough that the contradictions will become clear to those people at some point, and they'll realize that they're on the losing side. Okay, and I think that's very important. Okay, Barry. The impressive rise of secularism. Yes, that leads perfectly into Barry's question. Could it be that scientific socialism is a more reliable, better ally of movements for working class emancipation and liberation from all forms of oppression? Of course, that's what we hope people will come to realize. But they're not going to, lecturing at them is going to make them do it, as Lenin said. It will be through their own struggle in society that they will come to realize that. So we must remember in the early works of Lenin also, he said, we are atheists, socialists are atheists as a rule, he said, but that we don't try to bludgeon people by argument. We try to appeal to them to work with us, to struggle with us, and through that struggle come to realize that religion is a myth, and that we need to rely on the here and now, the world around us, our material conditions of existence as they stand now, and to fight for a better world in the process. And I have 1 more minute. So without the church, what institutions can we use to establish a sense of community among the working class, Kurt? Well, okay, there's all kinds, right? There's community centers, there's libraries, there's neighborhood houses, there are clubs, there are associations. There's a huge range of organizations out there. Just take them on the internet, anything that takes your interest. Look, a meetup group, try to find somebody else who's interested in the things you're interested in. And you'll find that there's an organization probably as well as a group of people interested in these things. So we have plenty of things to turn to other than religion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Emily? 4 minutes.
I'll go in reverse order just so I can respond to what Helen was just saying. I think the power of the church as a community institution goes beyond just, people with common interests. And the reason that, book clubs haven't superseded churches as a kind of fixture of community life is because it's not just about common interests, but it's a common way of living, and it's an investment in wanting to live a good way and support each other in that process. And I find there are very, very limited opportunities for people to gather in congregate settings where there is not just common interest, but common belief. And I think a viable alternative, as I was talking about with John earlier today, is unions. Unions used to be and still are in some places, but not nearly as strong as they were. But, they were family institutions. They were places that defended people, that protected communities, that were deeply, deeply invested in everyone's lives in the community and invested in the community itself, in the sustaining and stability and well-being of the community in ways that went beyond the superficial common interests and common ideology. It was a shared way of living and a shared ethos of living. And that's one of the things that I see as being a really powerful opportunity. But genuinely, I've talked to a lot of people. I did a whole master's research project on finding community in alternative places. And there are a lot of community groups that people describe as like being my church, in that they find that same sense of support, of interest, of shared community with multiple people. That is very, very difficult to form, that sense of true community. In a lot of ways, I know a lot of people who have found something akin to church in activism, in a shared belief system and a shared mutual care and mutual collaboration and love and trust and respect for all members of the community. Accounting for the impressive rise of secularism, I think the other panelists have covered it well. I think that, as I say, the investment in statehood has really backfired magnificently. And I think as we become a more pluralistic society and we welcome in diverse perspectives, there's a shift in belief. And the church particularly, but a lot of other faiths, have really alienated their membership by attempting to coerce and control for so long. And there's a pushback, and faith is going to need to adjust if it is to survive. I think there's still a lot that faith has to offer, but it's a complicated relationship, and I am ready for it to undergo some transformations. And finally, to Mitchell's question about evangelicals, as I say, how do we radicalize anyone? How do we deal with the rampant growth of the Christian right? We resist, as we resist anything else, as we resist misogyny, as we resist racism, as we resist homophobia in all other aspects. So we take the approach regardless. When their reaction to socialist transformation is hate and violence, a lot of Nazis were Christian, and they were no comrades of mine. So we need to, as I say, when I advocate for a united front, I am advocating for a united front with very, very small particular groups of people, not with Christianity as a whole. And I'll conclude there.
Okay, thank you. John?
Okay, first on Mitchell's question. I don't think in a direct sense we can have much influence on people who really believe all this stuff. But they can change very quickly under certain circumstances. What we can do is try to engage them in struggles that are in their own interests, and obviously in their own interests. And through that, a lot of them will change, their consciousness will change. But I mean, I don't think in terms of arguing or preaching at them is going to make any significant difference. On Kurt's question, I think one thing that might be considered is the whole concept of workers' councils. I mean, for example, I've often said that I like the Cuban electoral system a lot better than ours because there's no professional politicians. People are elected, they serve on a body, they're paid their salary for whatever job they do, plus expenses, and that's it. But there's no permanent politicians. And I think that if we had a system of workers' councils, or whatever you want to call them, Soviets, whatever, that a lot of the alienation could be overcome in those because they would discuss all kinds of questions about what should be done in various communities, and then, for instance, in this case, Canada as a whole, if there's still a Canada then. Barry's question, I would simply answer yes. I agree with that. Okay.
Okay, John. Thank you very much. So we have a couple of minutes left, so we're going to go back in case somebody really wants to say something that they've missed. And we're going to start off with Alex, Emily, Helen, and John. So Alex, is there something you'd like to say?
I choose to pass. Thank you.
Okay, Emily?
I just want to say thank you very much, everyone, for a lively conversation, and I look forward to continuing these conversations as we move forward together as comrades.
All righty. Helen?
Right, and similarly, I'd like to thank the other contributors. It was a very interesting session. I enjoyed it very much, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Okay, John?
Yeah, I think it was a good discussion. It was varied. I think maybe the subject, the way it was posed, was a bit too general because we did tend to go all over the place, which in some ways is good. But perhaps if we do something else along these lines, it would be a more targeted subject to discuss. But I would like to thank everybody that's involved in this, and Kurt for organizing everything, and Elizabeth for chairing, and keep tuned in.
Thank you, John. In fact, a special thanks to everybody, John, Emily, Alex, and Helen, and of course to Kurt, our producer. If you would like to talk to us about joining Socialist Action, write to socialistactioncanada at gmail.com or just call us at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. And once again, listeners, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next essay webcast will be on Thursday, April the 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Is China socialist or capitalist? With leading anti-poverty activist John Clark in Toronto and Professor Ken Hammond in New Mexico, USA. In the meantime and between time, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active.